This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
Calling all dog owners. Your furry friend deserves top-notch nourishment, and Ollie delivers the clean, fresh nutrition your dog needs in 5 flavors they'll absolutely flip over. Ollie is made in U.S. kitchens with ingredients carefully sourced from trusted growers and producers around the world, with absolutely no harmful fillers or preservatives. With protein-first recipes like fresh beef with sweet potatoes, fresh turkey with blueberries, or fresh lamb with cranberries, you might start thinking, dang, my dog eats better than I do. And that's probably true when it comes to Ollie. Give your pup a fresh start this new year by letting them taste test a personalized meal plan with Ollie. Head to ollie.com/Wondery. Tell them all about your dog and use code WONDERY to get 60% off your first box of meals when you subscribe today. Plus, they offer a clean bowl guarantee on the first box. So if you're not completely satisfied, you'll get your money back. That's OLLIE.com/Wondery and enter code WONDERY to get 60% off your first box. Start your dog's new year off right with Ollie. Start your dog's new year off right with Ollie.
Your weekly dose of romance and drama has arrived. Season 29 of The Bachelor is here, and Grant Ellis, certified hottie and former day trader, is trading his day job on Wall Street for a second chance at everlasting love. New episodes drop every Monday at 8/7 Central, bringing you fresh twists in Grant's journey to find his soulmate. This self-proclaimed mama's boy is all grown up and ready to invest his heart. Will his playful charm win over the house full of hopefuls, or will the competition prove too intense? From heartfelt moments to adrenaline-pumping dates, each week brings new surprises in the mansion. Will Grant find his perfect match or end up with a broken heart? Tune in every Monday at 8/7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu for new episodes of The Bachelor.
Well, I first got involved in Jodi's case when I was still a reporter, a crime reporter at WCCO-TV in Minneapolis, the CBS station. And Jodi was not this great, intriguing mystery. She was a local person who was living in Iowa at the time who went missing. And that intrigued us. She was a member of our family, if you will. Never met her, but it's kind of like law enforcement. You know, you feel that connection. And she was going to work that morning doing what we do. And she never made it. So that kind of had some things right there that pulled. But she initially was one of several cases I covered over the years. And when I got in depth on her case in 1998 or 97, I was covering a serial rapist in the Twin Cities. He was involved in 4 rapes in just over 2 weeks. And one of the things turned out the cops alerted us to was the fact that he'd been living in Mason City at the time Jodi went missing. And so we did some digging. We found out not only was he living in the city, in Mason City, he was living 2 blocks from her station. And there were just a lot of things that said, take a look. Eventually, we did some stories. The police did some more digging, and they basically said, we don't believe he's involved. But that's got me hooked. And I think once you make the connection with the family, already had some interest to begin with. And then about 14 years ago, I moved to California. And when I moved, I felt really bad leaving behind some of the cases I worked on in Minnesota, Jodi's and Jacob Wetterling's, another high-profile case. They were kind of my unfinished business. I kind of felt like I'd abandoned them. So I kept them on my desk in San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara area. I kept them on my desk in the newsroom there, photos of them.
That's Carolyn Lowe, a veteran crime reporter who's taken a strong interest in the disappearance of Mason City, Iowa television anchor Jodi Huisentruit. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Not long after graduating from St. Cloud University in Minnesota, Jodi Huisentruit got a break and started her broadcast journalism career with a CBS affiliate in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. She was instantly noted for her talent, and her career blossomed rapidly. with her taking positions at an ABC affiliate in Alexandria, Minnesota, and then KIMT, a CBS affiliate in Mason City, Iowa. That was a stepping stone to larger markets. It was a rapid rise by any standard at the time. On June 26, 1995, the 27-year-old's future in broadcast journalism seemed limitless. By June 27, 1995, she was gone. That morning, at about 4 a.m., Jodi's producer at the station called her apartment after noticing she had not arrived at work. When Jodi answered the phone, she told her producer that she had overslept and she was on her way. Jodi only lived 5 minutes from the station, but 2 hours later, she still wasn't there for the morning show. An hour later, the station called the police. When officers arrived at Jodi's apartment, they found a red Mazda Miata she had been driving in the parking lot, as well as evidence of a struggle. A bent key, a bag, a hairdryer, and at least one red high-heel shoe were found near her car. As police interviewed neighbors, they learned that some had heard screams around the time she was likely to have been leaving for work. A neighbor also noticed a white Ford Ecoline van, the type of van that might be used to shuttle you from the airport to a hotel, idling in the parking lot around the same time. Quickly, however, the trail went cold. Jodi's mom hired private investigators, consulted psychics, and pushed law enforcement, but no solid leads emerged in the case that would dramatically change the approach of those of us in journalism to our safety. In a traditional murder or abduction, the most likely suspect is someone who is close to the victim. But when we have parasocial relationships with people, as journalists or celebrities, there are many people who feel an affinity and connection to us that's not something we're always aware of, complicating the profile of the potential suspects. In 2004, two Minnesota television journalists, Josh Benson and Gary Peterson, created a 13-part series called the Huisentruit File. This led them to create a website called findjodi.com to become a clearinghouse for tips that might lead to Jodi. The group has also brought attention to the case, including episodes on CBS's 48 Hours and ABC's 2020. Last year, the case was featured on the Unsolved podcast, where retired FBI profilers examined the case, and findjodi.com has also produced 35 podcast episodes on the case. Carolyn Lowe is a part of findjodi.com, an all-volunteer group that now includes journalists, former law enforcement, and others. Carolyn's a veteran crime reporter who spent more than 34 years at WCCO-TV in Minneapolis and St. Paul and worked as a newsroom manager for KSBY-TV in Santa Barbara, California. Carolyn has a long history of reporting on cold cases. In 2015, Carolyn worked on a special assignment for a television station in Minneapolis and St. Paul on the 1989 disappearance of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling, whose body was found in a pasture north of Minneapolis in 2016, and whose killer confessed the same year. Since 2011, Carolyn has focused on Jodi's case as a part of the findjodi.com efforts. Carolyn has a background that's somewhat unusual among crime journalists. She graduated from the FBI Citizen Academy in Minneapolis, has a bachelor's degree in law enforcement from Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, and a master's degree in police leadership from the University of St. Thomas, which is also located in St. Paul. Carolyn once held a Minnesota police officer's license, and for 12 summers, she spent 2 weeks working as a foot patrol officer each year at the Minnesota State Fair in order to, as she said, walk the beat and get even more insight into police work. She's also become a licensed private investigator in order to help develop relationships that she hoped could help gain her insight into both Jacob's and Jodi's cases. Today, in the first of 2 episodes on Jodi's case, we're going to discuss Carolyn's career as a crime reporter, Jodi's life and her disappearance, how it changed journalism, investigating uncommon abductions, the difficulties of trying to unravel cold cases, and how loved ones of victims often rally quietly to support each other. We're also going to explore how loved ones and others can keep the cases in the public eye and why it matters. In our next episode, we'll explore some of the same issues, what Carolyn hopes for Jodi's loved ones, and the message she would send to the person who took her. So, hey, Carolyn, I just wanted to thank you for joining me. I had not at all heard about, which is kind of crazy to me, about Jodi's case. Just thinking that as somebody who kind of grew up in journalism and, her age isn't too far off of mine and her career is not too far off of mine. I had never heard of her case until, last year when you went on to my friend Julia Cowley's podcast, The Consult, and talked through the case. And I was fascinated by the case itself, but part of what I was also fascinated by was the work that those of you at Find Jodi were doing on the case. And I'm just really impressed with from my perspective, both in doing my research and looking at this, how you've really accumulated, a wealth of solid, reliable information about the case in a day and age where, it's really hard to trust what's out there about certain cases. And I think we're starting to see the point where that may be even getting in the way of some. So I was really grateful and glad to have connected with you and learned more about you. So thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I'm so grateful to people like you who help keep Jodi visible. And you never know the reach of your show, who might be listening, who might have something that might come forward. And Julia, I just reached out to her out of the blue after listening to her on a podcast, the FBI podcast with Jerry Williams. And I sent her a message, said, could you ever talk? She said, yeah, call me tomorrow. And she was off and running. Unbelievable. So I'm so grateful. We have a lot of allies and angels on this path, which is almost 30 years. It'll be 30 years from today, or 5 months from today, it'll be 30 years since Jodi was abducted.
Yeah, and I really do agree with you on the idea that you never know who's listening. You never know what's going to pull someone's heartstring or cause something to click in their head. And it can really be, and Julia's podcast is a great example of this. There's some recent episodes. It can really be the smallest thing that will trigger something that will lead to a resolution in some of these cases, and hopefully bring some of these people, even if they aren't alive, back to their families.
Exactly. We actually had an example last year. It's a podcast, and a woman originally from Mason City was listening to a pretty popular crime podcast, and she reached out to us because this is something I'd never heard before. But when she was about 14, she was running home from school, and there was a man behind Jodi's building who yelled out at her and chased her up the street to Kentucky Avenue in front of where Jodi was living. And she got away. But she was wondering after she heard the podcast if maybe the person who tried to grab her might be the same one of the people mentioned as a potential person of interest in the case. So I went and requested a copy of the police report, and we'd never heard about that before. And it was really kind of stunning to think that in May of 1995, 1 month before Jodi was abducted, there was a man behind her building exhibiting that kind of behavior. A lot about that behavior doesn't seem to fit the most likely person to have taken Jodi, but we didn't even know about it. And it had never been publicized at the time that there'd actually been an incident of that kind of thing a month before Jodi was abducted. And it was a podcast that got her to come forward.
Well, and it's the wildest thing, too, because I think sometimes, we can be critical of law enforcement or we can be critical of investigations, but I think it's hard to even fathom in a case this, probably I can only imagine how large the case file is, complex, how hard it is sometimes to pull pieces together. And it really does take someone saying, hey, do you remember that police report that this person or that I filed? And sometimes that's what breaks the case. I mean, like, A great example would be the Delphi case in Indiana, where Richard Allen was just convicted. It was really just a volunteer working in the office who picked up a file and looked at a piece of paper and said, "This makes no sense. This is the wrong last name." And that really is what broke the case.
They
Just
were
that
off and
one.
running. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Well,
that's it.
sometimes it's a fresh set of eyes. I mean, I feel it. I'm excited today. We announced another person just joined our team, Brian Weiss, and a couple of weeks ago, a former Minneapolis police investigator with extensive experience joined our team, rather. And they're bringing a whole new energy and a different set of eyes where the rest of us have been on this, most of us have been on the case for decades.
Yeah, no, and which actually just sort of brings me to a relatively sort of decent decent starting point, which is in and I know we'll get into Jodi's case, but one of the things that I was just curious about because you know you didn't personally know Jodi,
Yeah.
you had covered you know you'd covered a number of big cases in Minnesota and the related area, but how did you decide, by the way, after your career as a reporter sort of you wrapped that up? How did you get involved in this effort to find her?
Well, I first got involved in Jodi's case when I was still a reporter, a crime reporter at WCCO TV in Minneapolis, the CBS station. And Jodi was not this great intriguing mystery. She was a local person who was living in Iowa at the time who went missing. And that intrigued us. She was a member of our family, if you will. Never met her, but it's kind of like law enforcement. You feel that connection. And she was going to work that morning doing what we do. And she never made it. So that kind of had some things right there that pulled. But she initially was one of several cases I covered over the years. And when I got in depth on her case, in 1998 or 97, I was covering a serial rapist in the Twin Cities. He was involved in 4 rapes in just over 2 weeks. And one of the things turned out the cops alerted us to was the fact that he'd been living in Mason City at the time Jodi went missing. And so we did some digging. We found out not only was he living in the city, in Mason City, he was living 2 blocks from her station. And there were just a lot of things that said, take a look. Eventually, we did some stories. The police did some more digging, and they basically said, we don't believe he's involved. But that's got me hooked. And I think once you make the connection with the family, already had some interest to begin with. And then about 14 years ago, I moved to California. And when I moved, I felt really bad leaving behind some of the cases I worked on in Minnesota, Jodi's and Jacob Wetterling's, another high-profile case. They were kind of my unfinished business. I kind of felt like I'd abandoned them. So I kept them on my desk in San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara area. I kept them on my desk in the newsroom there, photos of them. And then Josh Benson from Find Jodi team asked me in 2011 if I'd be interested in joining the team. And the team is basically volunteers. They're all but one of us is a journalist. And we've all come to the team from having covered the story, having been hooked on it. Josh, and former news director at the station Alexandria, KAL, had done a number of stories back in the day on Jodi, and now he lives in Florida. Unfortunately, sadly, Gary passed away a few years ago, but we bring this kind of interest, and it just does, it doesn't go away. As I'm talking to you, I'm staring at pictures of Jodi. I have an album full of pictures of Jodi, and I'm wearing my Find Jodi t-shirt, and it's always there. And I keep thinking, what can we do? What skills that we have, contacts, we understand how the media works. What can we do to help bring her home? And we don't expect to have a good answer. Find her, she's not in Mexico or Hawaii, but for her family, they want to know, they want to say goodbye. They want to bring her home.
Yeah. One of the things I was just thinking about as you were talking, I feel like journalists are great at two things, other things too. Outside of one, wrapping ourselves in the First Amendment, I think the other thing that we're really good at is being hard on other journalists. And I think how hard we are on each other masks sometimes the fact that journalists tend to be for the most part, very mission oriented. They tend to care about people. This is just my experience in working with them. But the other thing that stands out to me, particularly for people who cover crime, is that there's certain cases that don't leave us.
Yes.
I remember, when I was reporting in New York, there are certain cases where, like, I will in my head flashback. You brought up that point about the serial rapist. There was a serial rapist in Brooklyn who was raping people at housing complexes, and he eventually graduated to murder. And I can still see like flashes in my head of different moments, or afterwards. There's this one moment I'll never forget. It was late at night. I'm walking out of Police Plaza, which is police headquarters in 1PP in New York, and it's got this like long walkway between it and the U.S. Attorney's office that you walk on. And I saw just like a kid's shoe
Oh,
laying there, and it reminded me of a case, and I just fell apart, and I'll never forget like
oh.
that moment. And even now, like now that I'm not reporting, and or at least not in a traditional sense, and I'm interviewing people, but there are cases for me like Delphi or Ashley Loring Heavy Runner in Montana, where you cover them, Brianna Maitland and Vermont's another one, and you just, on some personal level that's hard to even understand, because someone was asking me recently, like, why are these your cases? And I'm like, I don't know. I've just somehow connected with these stories, connected with these people, and will do anything I can to help solve them and help these folks find peace. And as much as we knock on, and I've traveled to those places, which is, some people may find weird. Traveled to Vermont on the Brianna Maitland one. I'm going to Montana on Ashley's case, not to cover it. I was in Minnesota in August, just visiting the family of one person in a case, not to cover it for me, but because I truly feel very connected, and almost, as someone who's a journalist, a responsibility to do exactly what you just said, like not let go. Like they're unfinished for me.
Right. And we know how to do it. We know what works. Like at Find Jodi, we put up on the 50th, Jodi's 50th birthday, we struggled. What can we do that's new? We've done a walk. We've done this. And we came up, the movie, what is it? 3 billboards outside Evans, Missouri came out. We said, why don't we try billboards? So we put them up, and it was incredible force multiplier. 48 hours showed up just to check it out on spec. And those billboards, and we got a really good rate because we're on a shoestring budget. They have gotten so much visibility for Jodi's case. They're shown over and over. Anytime there's an update, you'll probably see our billboard. And so it was something to do. And our message again is, it's time to bring Jodi home. And our first message in the billboard was, don't sit in silence. The time to talk is now. And someone knows something. Is it you? And now we're looking at something for the 30 years. But one of my favorite crime reporters, and she's also done a lot of fiction, is Edna Buchanan. I don't know if you've read.
Oh yeah, from Miami. Oh goodness
yes.
gracious!
Well,
yes.
her line is, you don't want to grow calluses on your heart, and that stays me. We don't want you. You have to get through the day, get through that difficult interview. But I don't ever want to lose that. I don't ever want to not care. And I talked to Jodi's sister this morning. We talk frequently, and it's very real. It's not an intriguing mystery or something that's going to get a lot of hits and downloads on streaming. This is real life, and we're in a position to help those people. And it's, we mentioned when we were as journalists, I've always felt what I did was so purposeful. And now I feel, even in I don't like to call it retirement. I like to call it self-assignment. I borrowed that from a photographer. In my self-assignment, not being paid, I feel like it's a very purposeful, meaningful, and frustrating and humbling, because, I think, have any of this stuff made any difference? I don't know. We won't know until it's solved.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think about, I was talking to you when we were off mic about, Monty Frank, who was the Ojibwe man whose daughter, Nada, went missing when she was 16. She was murdered in her early 20s, right as she was getting her life back together again. One point he very often makes to me is see how hard it was for him and his family, even though he was a law enforcement officer. So he was in emergency management. So he knew the police, the state police rallied for him, the St. Paul police rallied for him, all sorts of people. And he knew how to access those systems, and it was still that hard. And I think about, for somebody like you or I, if I, God forbid, had a loved one missing, I know how to get a news hook, right?
Yeah.
I know how to get the attention of the media, and not everybody, and the media can be a powerful force in solving some of these cases and building awareness. And not everyone has that. Like, what advice would you have for people who don't?
It's a mixed thing. I suggest that, from my experience, it's good to make some noise to keep your person visible. Ways to make noise. One is to be, I know one person that Patty Wetterling used to take, I believe, chocolate chip cookies to the investigators, go down, checking in with them, make phone calls, keep it real. And I know from law enforcement's end, they often get frustrated because they say it's tough to say nothing new, but to the families, they just want to hear a voice. They want to make that connection. So I would work both the end of keeping up with the investigators, and then identify some reporters in your community. Find the person that, you can follow their work, see somebody who handles a case maybe you think is better than someone else, and shoot them an email, make a request to talk with them. If there's an anniversary coming up of your loved one's disappearance or their murder, that's a hook. As you know, the media needs hooks. If you're putting up flyers or your family's creating a Facebook page, many families I know in the last 10 years have created social media pages. In fact, Jodi's family, despite all the publicity they get, at times I know there's been frustrations because you can't control the narrative. And so they have, Jodi's niece has created a Facebook page called Jodi's Hope, where she wants to put memories, photos, keep the personal part of Jodi out there. And it's also an opportunity, if something isn't done correctly, in her opinion, it's too sensational, whatever the media, it's a chance to have a little bit of a narrative to speak out. And I think that's empowering for a lot of families. So there are a lot of tools there. And I've written a story for Unsolved magazine. I'll be happy to give you a link at the end of your podcast, or just some other ways to do it. The flip side is some families don't feel so good after they've done interviews. Sometimes it's just a hit and run artist, in there getting their soundbite, move on, and just trying to help coach them through it, or what to expect. Never forget the camera is always on, things like that, that I think that we can help them. And I try to do with not just Jodi's family, but other families as well.
Yeah, and even knowing, like, your point about making sure they know the camera's always on, also knowing, like, the simple things like, if you say a soundbite like this, it will get used, even if it is not your most important point. So,
Right.
And I think even the interviews sometimes that can or help, or interviews that can have impact, can also be draining. And I think being able to prepare yourself emotionally for some of that stuff, which actually brings me to a relatively good segue to, I'm just stepping back and just sort of thinking about this. Over the years and covering the story, what have you learned about Jodi? Like, one of the things that stuck out to me in listening to and reading about her story, and I felt like I've worked with people who are like her, young, ambitious, talented, filled with promise. Like, she showed all those signs of somebody who had the potential, was limitless in terms of her journalism. And I don't think that's even an exaggeration with the way that her career was moving. And she also seemed to be an interesting person. And I'm just curious, what have you found out about her so far?
Well, I think she was very ambitious. She had indicated she hoped someday to be anchoring a morning show on the network. That was the direction she was going in. And she had that kind of talent, which, as a journalist, my thing was doing digging and investigative. That really wasn't Jodi's thing. So one of the rumors for years had been maybe Jodi was investigating some big drug ring. That wasn't what Jodi did. Jodi was more the lifestyle, the people stories. And she was very athletic. She was not very tall, but she was physically pretty strong. She was co-captain of the basketball team in her high school. She was a very accomplished golfer. Her state high school team went to the States, won 2 years in a row. In fact, the day before Jodi disappeared, she was participating in a charity golf fundraiser all-day event in Mason City. So she loved to golf. If I had to describe a passion, she loved to golf. But she was very ambitious at the time she disappeared. She had also been applying for jobs in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I worked. And I talked to a woman, a former news director at the NBC affiliate, who called Jodi in, I believe, May before she disappeared, after Jodi sent her audition reel, and gave her some hints because the news director at the time had been from Mason City herself. So there was a relatability. That same video, like a month or so later, was used as part of their coverage of her disappearance. So it's a horrible twist. But she had a lot of ambition. She had so many friends. Her friends were kind of subsets of her friends from Long Prairie, a small town where she grew up, then her college friends and her work friends and her friends in Mason City. She sent greeting cards to everybody. I mean, so many of them have shared her cards and her messages, and they have them to this day. And she just stayed just really a socially outgoing, connecting person. And I think that gift that she had came across so well anchoring the morning news. People felt they knew her. She was in their living rooms for the two, at the morning when she did the show from 6 to 7. And that's why we wonder if to this day, if that connection, did somebody feel they were connecting back with her? Did that person stalk her? We don't know who took her, but that's certainly one of the angles I think you have to look at, given that she was so accessible. If you went to the grocery store, they said she took forever to get through the line because people wanted to talk to her. They just felt this connection with her vibrant personality, which, you can't fake that in our business. I mean, she had that something, and I think it was very much the real deal.
And that's a interesting point, because I was just thinking as you were talking before you said that, it seemed like she was really one of those broadcast journalists who was really sort of focused on building a sense of community and belonging.
Totally.
And with that, there's so many beautiful things. Like I feel like if my mom, who passed away in 2023, if she gave me anything other than unconditional love for people in the face of no matter what, I think she gave me a understanding of the importance of community. But one of the flip sides of that is that when you are in a position like a broadcaster or, a radio host or a podcaster or whatever it is, you end up building these parasocial relationships with people that can be very healthy, but there are always going to be some outliers who feel as if they're building a relationship with you that's a lot deeper than may exist. And, people I know who have worked in broadcast television have always had a little bit of a concern about that.
Oh, I totally agree. As a reporter, I was not as visible as, say, the anchors. But I remember when I was pregnant with our first child, and I was the first person on the air to have a baby at WCCO back in 1984. And I had people come up to me and touch my stomach. I was in Target, and a woman came up to pat my belly, and I felt very invasive, but I had to be nice. You're so thrilled to you to. And this is before they had us doing social media and doing Facebook and connecting. And Jodi was incredibly accessible. Nowadays, she'd be even more accessible with social media, but she was everywhere. I think she thrived on it on one level. But she also had some concerns, and maybe we can touch on that. I mean, there was an incident October of 94, so about 9 months before she was taken, where a guy in a truck was driving when she was out for a walk jogging, and it made her very uncomfortable to the point that she called police. And mind you, for someone on the air to call police and make a report, with all the attention you get, that had to have spooked her a lot. And her back then, the phone numbers were listed in the directory. Jodi's phone number, her home address was in the local directory. Her apartment faced the parking lot where she was abducted. And you could see her coming down the stairs. And I think people are even more cautious nowadays because of what happened to Jodi, people that work those kind of shifts. But there wasn't that same fear back then, even though, as I said, Jodi had some things. She also told some people at the golf tournament the day before she was taken that she'd been getting some kind of nasty phone calls and was going to change her phone number. Now,
that's interesting.
So we don't know if these were just things that were parallel, that were going on, but they're She took a self-defense course in March, and the people who gave her the lesson told me she just had a sense that somebody was following her. So she did have that kind of sense you hear about, the gift of fear type of thing. But we don't know. But could this just be a parallel event that's going on, or is it connected to what happened to her? We don't know.
Or, and the hard part of it too is, as your audience or your admirers grow, there's always going to be a small percentage, but that small percentage grows along with your audience. But I didn't think of like one point that you just made there, that as a broadcast journalist, I think not everyone will understand that almost the last thing that you want to do, actually as a journalist, period, is whine to the police about something that's happening to you. One, because you're probably going to hear about it every other day for the rest of your career there.
It's going to be spread around. Yeah.
It's going to be spread around. Yeah. It's going to make it to your competitors, and you're going to have to pray they don't publish it. Yeah. And so you're right. That really would be, I think, for most journalists in her position, a really big deal. It would have to be a really big, uncomfortable thing. I remember one time when I was working in New York, I got a call from the NYPD Intelligence Bureau, and they were like, this organization, I'm not going to name it, it's controversial, but this organization is threatening your life. Do you want us to do something about it? That's the way it was. And I was like, my editors were annoyed with this, but I was like, absolutely not. And I was thinking the exact same thing. The last thing I need is the New York Post page 6 to find out.
Pride baby.
Right. Yes.
Pride real tears. Yeah.
Exactly.
But I think particularly as a young woman in her position, or I would say in my situation after I had kids, my married name is different than what my name was on the air. So I took steps to try to, to this day, I'm careful with my grandkids in terms of what I show. And there's so much that people put out there in social media, but I think you have to think about that. And Jodi wasn't even part of it. They didn't have Facebook and, Twitter, X and all that back then. And now you'd be even more. And they push it. The only reason I started on Facebook 14, 15 years ago was because my station wanted us to feel more relatable and more connected to the people who follow it. And there's a plus side. Clearly I've tracked down people, I've reached people, I've made connections through those social media, but there's another side to that someone like a young woman, 27-year-old young anchor living alone is potentially to be so much more vulnerable with these things going on out there.
You made a comment before about like how what happened to Jodi changed things. Do you think that in a big sort of like national way, it changed things for broadcast journalists? How big a moment was it?
I think it was one of those things that for journalists who weren't even born back then, it changed it. I know my daughter was a morning producer at the NBC affiliate in San Luis Obispo out here, and she was going in the middle of the night. And I was always thinking about Jodi when she's my daughter. It's also short and blonde. That went through my head. And when she would tell me that she ran down the hill one night to a gas station to pick up some food, I'm like, oh my God, it's so hard as a crime reporter not to go there and think of that. Mm-hmm. And what hasn't changed much, though, I've heard from journalists, is a lot of them still don't get much protection. They may be coming in at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, and going into a fairly dark area, and they don't, but they're very aware. Jodi is on their minds. I belong to a group of multimedia journalists, women that communicate. I think safety is always on their mind, more so than I think for the male journalist, just as a woman alone, being in that kind of position and wanting to seem accessible.
Yeah, and it's another great point I think you make is, I think other people, I think about my neighborhood, which is like one of those multi-use. We've got retail, we got apartments, we got like condos, we got all sorts of stuff in there. And other people walk around and they see stores, and I see bricks that could fall off the wall and kill someone. I see alleyways that would be a really great place to get robbed. I see I see sniper nests sometimes. And
my husband was saying, when I was back in Minnesota this summer for Jodi's anniversary event we do every year. And, I'm driving down St. Paul where we lived, and I'm pointing, oh, that's where so-and-so was found and such and such. He said, would you just stop for a minute? But, I can't, it's all there. And there are so many memories. And it's really something when you see those places. The flip side is I think that the media has done a job of making people so afraid of stranger danger and things. Well, I know enough. I think I had less fear about that because I knew it was more likely maybe a soccer coach or someone you knew,
Right.
someone jumping
Right.
out of the bushes. But I know our neighbors and other people we knew probably were more fearful that way than I was. But given what we do, we've met the Patty Wetterlings. I've met Jodi's family, and I can't imagine what it'd be like to not. I think I would just crawl under my covers and never come out if I lost a child. But they have to, and it's tough.
And they do. It's really admirable. Like you brought up Patty and Wetterling, and this is just such a proof that the world is small. And I had mentioned to you that Monty Frank, who I had mentioned before, Patty Wetterling had connected with him when his daughter went missing, and she was very helpful to him. And Jacob Wetterling, probably, wouldn't you say probably the most famous Minnesota missing persons case?
And he changed how we raised a generation of children because of what happened. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it was, I think it was like October 1989.
Correct.
Or,
yes.
Yeah, and, he was in St. Joseph, Minnesota.
Small, quiet, rural community.
Yeah. Right, and he's about 11 years old. And as I recall, the way the story went, that his brother, who I think was a little younger than him, and a friend had gone biking to a convenience store somewhere in St. Joseph. I forget what they had gone. Were they going to get a video?
Yeah.
Okay.
They went to get a video. And
Okay.
They were biking home in this quiet little neighborhood.
Yeah, and then at some point, someone then approached them wearing a mask or something along those lines, and a gun. Order the boys to sort of discard their bikes, and then asked how old each of the boys were. And I think, as I recall, like he ended up somehow picking Jacob. Frightening. Yeah, frightening scenario. And, over the years, Patty created a foundation, has been very helpful to other families. The case was recently came to a resolution, but you had mentioned to me that Jodi had actually covered Jacob's case. Tell me
unbelievable. When Jodi was, I believe, a senior in college studying communications at St. Cloud State, she and some of her friends interviewed Patty Wetterling. They actually went to the Wetterling home, which is, I think, less than an hour from where she was going to school, and they interviewed her. And then when Jodi was an anchor after she graduated, she was an anchor reporter at Station Alexandria, Minnesota, not too far from there. And she interviewed Patty as well. So to think that she'd been in Jacob's home. And the other kind of connections is Jodi and Jacob were both born in Long Prairie, Minnesota, tiny town not far from St. Cloud. Jacob is from Mason City. His grandmother on his father's side. His dad grew up, or Jacob wasn't from there, but his dad was from Mason City. So there are these connections. And last summer at our event to remember Jodi, Patty Wetterling was our keynote speaker and appealing for people to come forward. And Patty, by the way, has written an excellent book called Dear Jacob, and it's heartbreaking, but I think there are a lot of lessons for journalists and law enforcement, or anybody investigating a case, things to do, not to do. I read it before it came out, and I read it on the plane flying with my family to Hawaii, and I had to put on my sunglasses because I'm sobbing all the way through it. But it's empowering to see what she did. It's inspiring. And that just came out last year, and now it's her paperback version. And she wrote it with a woman named Joy Baker. You may have read about her. Joy was a blogger who started working on Jacob's case several years before he was found, and brought some attention to some other incidents that had happened with a man who was grabbing young boys not too far from where Jacob lived, and didn't get a lot of attention. I mean, I kick myself to this day that we didn't know about it then, because we could have reported on it. And eventually, when they ended up getting the person who took Jacob and led them to his remains and admitted to everything as part of a plea deal, he was the same guy who was doing those things. And just so she had a real role of keeping it visible and coming up with some new information that was really key in the end to getting answers.
And
They weren't
that's like,
good answers. That Patty didn't change her phone number. She never moved because she still hoped that Jacob would come in that back door, come home.
yeah, not the answer that,
No.
that
But
they,
she says, and we talk about Jodi, and we've interviewed Patty for our Find Jodi podcast. It's better in the end to know there is a peace that she has now, to not be living what they call ambiguous loss, to not know what is the scenario, to have it resolved, have a chance to say goodbye. She got his little red hockey jacket back, the one that he wore at 11. She just.
One of the things that Patty actually said to Monty that was really fascinating to me, because I have always heard the stories of her waiting for Jacob to come home. When Nada went missing, I think it was the second time she went missing, she told him, you have to prepare yourself. You have to prepare yourself to bury your child. And I just thought, oh, gosh.
No parent should ever have to do that, but she
He
knew.
was so grateful, though, to hear to be able to get that honest advice, because the point that you made, ambiguous grief, you don't really know when your child or your other loved one is missing. You don't even know what you're supposed to be grieving.
Oh, yeah. Well, one of the things that I see Jodi's family go through is, say, if some remains are found in Iowa, anytime anything is found in Iowa, we always get on it really quickly. And I try as fast as I can to find out if it's not Jodi, as much to let the family know, because, but as they hear scenarios, or a couple of months or so ago, we did something on somebody who's being looked at as a potential serial killer. And then they go through, okay, look at the horrific stuff he's done. Could that have happened to Jodi that way? Trying to get reconciled with what horrific thing, and hoping. I know that Jodi's family sister feels it was some kind of accident. It's just horrible to think that you're trying to visualize something you could live with and not knowing which scenario may turn out to be the one that involves your loved one.
Yeah. It's also wild to think that, someone like Jodi took an interest in Jacob's story. I mean, obviously took an interest, kind of like what we were talking about before, like you and I, these cases that don't leave us. Yeah. And it sounded like, Jacob was one of those cases that really touched her. And then for her to go missing, and then for Patty to step in to help her family. Like there's something so sad about that, but also something so beautiful about it.
Well, Patty's been amazing, and I know that she would, she's often said if they want anything, and she's done that with many, many other families as well. And
it's funny how love can boomerang around sometimes like that.
Yeah, I've reached out to her with other cases, just what do you think, or just trying to her insight, because she's been around so many, and she wants to continue to give, to help people.
So, you were a reporter in Minneapolis at the time, and, just speaking, or in Minnesota at the time, and speaking sort of just geographically, Mason City, Iowa is on the border, not too far from like the Rochester market. Like
right. It's about 2 hours south of Minneapolis. So it's a pretty quick drive.
Yeah. So it's not that far. And Jodi was from Minnesota, you mentioned, from Long Prairie, which was near the St. Cloud area. So even though she was in Iowa, she's still probably a part of the broader Minnesota family. I'm just curious, like do you remember how you first heard about the case, or started covering it, and what that stage was like?
1995, if you remember, is a very violent time in our country, and I was actually somewhat embedded in the Minneapolis Police Homicide Unit. They had agreed to let me and a photographer I work with go inside, and the New York Times had actually dubbed Minneapolis Murderapolis. And they broke the record that year for the number of homicides. And so I was very immersed in, frankly, a lot of gang killings, drug killings. There weren't many high profile ones, but I was kind of on call. The 4 investigators we were following had something. So
it's so funny. That was the year that in our newsroom, we dubbed Baltimore Bodymore Murderland.
oh, gee.
It was
Aren't they
bad.
clever? Oh, my God. And Murderapolis, I mean, that stuck with them for a couple, it's just like, I don't know, sometimes we felt like these people on the East Coast sort of trivializing or encapsulating their view of it. But it was a particularly violent time, and I was very busy with that. I remember hearing about it. I was not covering it initially. The local CBS station where Jodi worked, KIMT, was providing us with most of our video and stories at the time versus having a crew there. And then it was not till about 2 years later, when I was covering a serial rapist, that Jodi was still missing, that it was brought to my attention that this person who I covered as a rapist in the Twin Cities was from Mason City and had moved up to the Twin Cities. And the reason they were looking into Mason City and other places is you don't usually just wake up one morning and rape 4 women in 2 weeks. And, what was going on before. So they were looking at various places he lived. And again, the police did not believe. They did some follow-up and they don't believe that he's connected. But, having been involved in that end of it and connected with Jodi, talked to her mother, got to know her family, her friends, I couldn't just put it on a shelf and move on to something else.
Yeah. Her case it feels like an outlier. I think we know, right? The people who pay attention to the nuance, just like you've been alluding to or saying throughout the conversation, that if something bad befalls you, you go missing, you're murdered, you're punched in the face, chances are it's someone relatively close with you or who knows you or has had some interaction with you. Could you walk us through sort of like what happened to Jodi and why it sort of stands out as an outlier to you?
Well, for one thing, it happened so quickly. Every time I go to Mason City, I kind of walk back from her apartment to the parking lot. It's about a 30-second walk from the time she left her apartment to when she was taken away. And think about that. She's on her 2nd-story apartment. Light goes out. She comes down the steps, visible to somebody probably waiting for her in the parking lot, because there's no way somebody just driving by could go, oh, I'm going to go in there. You wouldn't have time. So somebody had to be waiting. She comes down the steps, goes 12 steps from her building to her red Mazda Miata, which she'd only had about 2.5 weeks. And somebody, I believe, ambushes her from behind. They drag her out of there. Left behind are her heels, blow dryer, hairspray, bet key, which one more indication of some kind of a struggle. Nobody called police. At that particular morning, Jodi was running late. She'd back up and say that her producer, Amy Coombs, called her because she was more than a half hour late. She was supposed to anchor the news at 6 a.m., 5-minute drive to her station. Jodi sounded fine, just like when Amy called her. So all this happened in such a short amount of time. But whoever took her had 3 hours before police were called because Amy continued to crank out the show. She's all by herself. There was a weather person doing the weather. They just figured Jodi had fallen back to sleep because they called again. Amy called again, no answer. And then when Jodi had Jodi had been late sometimes before. She had never missed air. I mean, that's such a fatal thing in our business. You don't miss slot. You don't miss air. So
Career killer.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So after Amy had to go ahead, not only did she write everything, she had to go on and report. And she did the news from 6 to 7. Shortly after 7, she was getting ready to do some more little updates. A manager walks in. She asks him to, call police check and make a welfare check on Jodi. So they go over to her building, figuring she probably, as I said, fell back asleep. And right away, you could see in the parking lot, things weren't right. There's her car still there. And these items scattered very close to the car. We later learned that they lifted a partial palm print off the car and found a hair. Don't know much more about it. Up in her apartment, according to the landlady who took the police in, nothing really looked amiss. Her bed was partially made, but it was just more like the covers were pulled up. Years later, one of the investigators said that the toilet seat was up in the bathroom, and there's been a lot of speculation. What did that mean? Did she have a male visitor? Could it have been a cop who was there assigned to watch the apartment because everybody was focused on the parking lot? We just don't know. But she was gone, just 30 seconds. So whoever did it had to be comfortable enough to be there, to grab her, drag her out of there, and be gone. It was still dark, but it was incredibly, incredibly fast.
Yeah. Did they, what was it that initially told the cops that something was wrong as soon as they got to the parking lot? Because police do tons of welfare checks on a regular daily basis. The number of times I've called the police to do a welfare check on someone is, just from the work that I do in mental health, you realize it happens a lot more frequently. And usually what they find is someone depressed or asleep, or pass out. What was it that tipped them off?
I think the couple things at the car, the bent key, the driver's side, the mirror was pushed forward, her red heels scattered on the ground. I mean, those are things that these aren't right. Jodi's, they didn't know right away they were Jodi's, but it's right there at the car. So there was clearly signs of a struggle. They later found some drag marks. So it had been the silt leading away. It had been raining before, kind of indicating they believe that she was probably being led up somewhere to a vehicle up on Kentucky Avenue, which is right in front of her apartment complex, which is it's a 3-building complex. It's like a horseshoe, and Jodi's was the smallest one. So again, nobody could have just seen her driving down the entrance on the street. This had to be somebody waiting for her, whether it was somebody who knew her or maybe someone who thought they knew her because they'd stalked her. As I mentioned earlier, she was in the phone book, her address in the phone book. I talked with other residents who said they saw her getting ready some morning. Some of them who themselves went to work at 4:00 in the morning could see her in her apartment. So she would have been very easy to wait for and be ready to jump out and grab her and then just get out of there.
Yeah.
And whoever took her had to know that given her not making TV, if they knew it was Jodi Huisentruit, the morning anchor, that they had to expect that there would have been a massive turnout, like much sooner than there was, instead of a good 3 hours before anybody called police.
Yeah, that's one of the things I was thinking, that if you were going to grab someone, if you had been following this anchor, you knew they were an anchor as opposed to just, thinking of them as some random person that you'd been watching, you would know that morning when they work is probably the time that it's going to get reported. But then on the other hand, morning is probably really early in the morning when it's dark is probably also the moment where you have the most opportunity to get someone.
Well,
alone.
In Jodi's case, if you didn't get her at that point, there's no guarantee at the end of her shift. I mean, if you knew that she had to be on the air at 6:00, even though she was running late that day, if she was coming out, you had a window at which you had to grab her. Where at the end of the day, Jodi could go into the Y where she went frequently, or she could go out to lunch. No guarantee where Jodi would have been. Where at this time of day, that location was the one guarantee that you'd have access to Jodi.
We're going to go ahead and end today's episode, and we'll be back in a few days with our next episode with Carolyn, where we're going to discuss more of Jodi's case and also a lot about what she hopes for in the case in terms of resolution and what she hopes for the family. Please come back in a few days and check it out. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For those of you interested in true crime, check out our new publication on Substack with Brett and Alice of the Prosecutors podcast called The True Crime Times. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, and to support the podcast, you can also join us over on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again in a few days.